This podcast has been created by volunteers from the Museum of Norwich, in collaboration with the Norfolk Record Office in its role as the East of England hub for the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project. This is a national endeavour which is digitally preserving rare and at-risk sound archives and encouraging their use. Unlocking Our Sound Heritage is led by the British Library and made possible with thanks to the National Lottery Heritage Fund. This podcast has been created using sound recordings from the Norfolk Record Office's permanent collection, which has been digitised and catalogued by the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project.
A Good Local Pub, Reflections on the Old Barge Public House and the King Street area it served. This is a podcast compiled by Barry Wilkinson. William Blake, the poet and painter, said, "A good local pub has much in common with a church, except that a pub is warmer and there's more conversation." For several hundred years, the Old Barge in Norwich's King Street was one such good local pub. Indeed, it was once claimed that King Street without the Old Barge and the nearby music house was as unimaginable as Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. As the landlord's daughter, Elsie Stockley, spent her childhood and teenage years there in the 1930s and 40s, this podcast features Elsie's personal recollections, providing a brief snapshot in the long and varied history of not just the pub itself, but also the wider King Street locality. The Old Barge formed part of a hall house built in the 1400s by Robert Tops, a prominent city merchant. It had a groined 12th century cellar on top of which was a 14th century floor, a 15th century superstructure and 16th century oak screens. Originally it was probably part of a trading hall, but is depicted on 14th century maps as Medes Inn, after Robert Mede, a city bailiff in the reign of Edward III. Elsie describes the layout of the pub.
When we moved there, the big door was there, the great big arch door. I had a key about that long. That used to hang up in the bar. And you used to go up the stairs and there was like a little cubby hole that you used to bend down and go through into the bedrooms. And the bedrooms used to lead off one another. There was no corridors or anything between the bedrooms. You'd go through this little cubby hole and you'd be in one bedroom. Then you'd go through another door and you'd be in another bedroom. And then you'd go through another door and you'd be in another bedroom. So there was no landings. It was just like a little, what I used to call a monk's hole, really, that you used to bob through to go into the bedrooms. And then, of course, when the war was on and we got bombed out, they decided that they were going to alter it all, which they did. And they took part of next door into the barge as well, because that wasn't as big then, but they took that in and made that all one big place.
So how big was the actual pub? That was downstairs?
The downstairs we had a lounge at the... Next door there was a lounge, there was a bar, and then you'd go through into the smoke room, a big smoke room, and you'd have a cellar going down the stairs. And you'd go upstairs and you'd have your 3 bedrooms through this little cubby hole thing. You'd have your lounge and your kitchen and your bathroom. But they took, where the clergy used to live, they took part of that into the barge and made it much, much bigger.
King Street is one of Norwich's longest and oldest thoroughfares. More than 1,500 years ago, it was a footpath between a cliff and a river leading to the Anglo-Saxon settlements that were the beginning of Norwich. The river brought trade to the area, and Conesford Street, later King Street, became lined with mansions, merchants' houses and a Benedictine priory. From the Middle Ages to the 18th century, this was an area of great dignity and opulence. As the trade from the river grew, the swarming growth of the Victorian era changed the character of the area significantly, with breweries, other industries and shops establishing a presence. By the early 1900s, cattle would wend their way from Trouse Station to the Saturday market by the castle, and the rattle of Norwich Electric Tramways Car 8 might be heard en route to the Orford Place. Elsie recalls the area during her youth in the 1930s.
There was Hayden's the butchers. Bakers, sorry. And then there used to be Barber's the fish shop. And I think it was Bircham's the butchers, yes, next door to the fish shop. And Swatman's was on the other corner.
What about going back the other way?
There was a goldsmith down there somewhere at one time. There was a sweet shop on one of the corners. And then Aldous, the ice cream people, they were down there during the war. In Old Barge Yard itself, that used to be all little terraced houses, up until just before the war. And then they pulled them all down and rehoused those people.
Yeah.
And then they built a big air raid shelter in Old Barge Yard itself. There used to be coal yards at the bottom there. They were there for a while. There was a big coal yard at the bottom. They were there for a while, but then they just disappeared.
In the Second World War, Norwich was one of several English cathedral cities targeted in the so-called Baedeker air raids during the Blitz. Between July 1940 and November 1943, the city was bombed 43 times, resulting in 340 deaths and 1,092 injuries. In 1939, the total housing stock had been 35,569, of which over 30,000 were damaged in some way by the end of the war. Air raid shelters were sometimes rudimentary, as Elsie explains.
You didn't use the cellar under the old barge then?
Yes, we did at one time. My sister and I had a bed down there at one time during the war, and we also had a Morrison shelter in the smoke room at the back of the barge as well.
What's the Morrison shelter?
It was a great big iron or steel thing. It you could put a mattress in the bottom. It was reinforced. And it was just like a table, really. It looked like a big overgrown table.
So that a Morrison shelter was meant for indoors?
Yes, it was an indoor shelter, yes, that's right.
What about the shelter in the old barge?
In the old barge yard, we did go in there once or twice, but I think during the war, people went where they thought they were going to be safe, do you know what I mean?
The heaviest raids took place over the nights between the 27th and the 29th of April 1942, when 297 high-explosive bombs weighing a total of 95 tons rained down upon the city. 231 people were killed with 689 injured. It was on those nights that the old barge was damaged, along with the Jolly Maltzers further down King Street and nearby St Julian's Church. Elsie was 13 at the time and remembers the experience vividly.
St Julian's Alley, that got bombed during the war. St Julian's Church got a bomb on it. And of course all those little terraced houses came down that night. That particular night we were under the cellars under Morgan's Brewery, across the road. The fire bombs, of course, were dropping, and they were coming down the cellar steps. And I remember one old lady, she really got hysterical because the fire bombs were coming down the stairs. There were so many dropped that night, they just come and rolling down the stairs. The men were there and putting them out, etc. as they came down. Everywhere was alight, bombs were dropping. And some man came and he had a lorry. I don't know who he was, I never ever knew who he was. And he took all the women and children out to Poor England because they left the men to fight the fires, etc. and to do what they could. And I can remember we were going up Burr Street and the old fire bombs were falling and we were going over the fire bombs as they were dropping. And Bonds was all alight and was falling all in. And places up there were afire. It was a fantastic... How he ever got us out to Poor England, I just do not know. Being a child, it was terrifying, but then it wasn't really terrifying as it was for mothers, if you know what I mean, with having the children with... To us, it was something that was happening, well, at that particular... I mean, you don't realise, you don't have the same fear when you're a child as you do as you grow up. Now, looking back on it now, it was terrifying, but at that particular moment in time, it was an adventure, really.
Elsie's father, William John Wodehouse, had become licensee of the Old Barge in September 1933. When war was declared, he joined the armed forces, leaving his wife Ivy and daughter in charge. A feature in the Pubs Trade's Morning Advertiser commented at the time, "Such houses are particularly needed now, for among all British institutions, inns and taverns are of the greatest value in the fostering of an optimistic and balanced outlook on life and the counteracting of the twin evils of defeatism and depression." Elsie describes what it all meant for her helping her mother.
There was always plenty of cleaning to do. Washing shelves down, washing glasses, filling up the shelves underneath. I mean, early mornings, we used to be up, and I used to do a day's work perhaps before I went to school or to work, you know, because that had to be done, and there was only us to do it.
What did you used
Used
to
to
do?
scrub,
What was the routine of running
well,
the floor?
scrub the floors, clean the fireplaces out, wash and polish all the tables, the seats, make sure the fires were laid to light if it was going to be winter and they had to light the fires. Fill all the bottles up onto the shelves, you know, on the shelves, make sure all the bottles were there and make sure all the glasses were clean, all the shelves were clean. My mother couldn't abide dust anyway. And make sure there was enough cases of bottles up from the cellar outside, you know, near so she could get to them if necessary. I mean, besides that, they all used to be upstairs, had to be done. I mean, your own living apartments had to be cleaned, your bedrooms had to be cleaned, and so on. There was no such thing as cleaners in those days. You never had cleaners. You'd done it all yourself. It was as simple as that. You just got on with the job.
So it's an early start to the day.
Well, yes, terribly early
And
start.
a late ending.
And a late ending, yes,
What were the pub
definitely.
hours?
Well, they used to open about 10 in the mornings, I think, 10, 10:30 in the mornings. And I mean, they used to perhaps close here. Well, even after they closed at night, there were certain things that had to be done before they could say they were absolutely packed up and they could go to bed. That was 11 o'clock and that was it. But I mean, sometimes my dad didn't used to get upstairs perhaps, and have a drink before he went to bed until perhaps 12, 12:30. Then you'd be up early in the morning.
Just like other parts of the city, the area around King Street was changed by the war. To the west and stretching up the steep slopes to Bear Street lay the affectionately named Village on the Hill. Originally a Victorian network of streets, courtyards, crowded tenements, insanitary cottages and terraced houses. Covering an area of 56 acres, there were nearly 3 miles of streets and passages, also serving 42 shops, 4 offices, 22 public houses, 25 industrial premises, 27 warehousing and storage premises, 2 schools and 7 places of assembly. Slum clearance work by the City Council some 20 or so years later would inevitably sweep much of this away. But in the late 1940s and early 50s, a strong and vibrant sense of community spirit remained amongst those living there, as Elsie explains.
I think the war brought a lot of changes in that street, because once the war came and they started, just before the war, they started clearing, a lot of these places out. I suppose to them they were, I don't know, perhaps slum places, I don't know. Because the street itself, I mean, it was a very friendly street. All the people were friendly, and I mean, you'd never go out and lock your doors. You'd always leave your doors open. You'd know nobody'd go in your doors. And if anybody was ill, there was always somebody asking if they could help or if they could do something for you. I mean, it was a marvellous street, really, when you think about it. Not like they are today. I mean, you could be ill in somewhere today and nobody would know you were ill even. They wouldn't even care.
We began this story by calling the Old Barge a good local pub, something that it certainly needed to be given the intense local competition. Back in the 1700s it had been known as the Two Merry Wherrymen, but by 1806 it was the Old Barge, and just one of King Street's rapidly growing number of watering holes. As local trade grew, more people arrived to live in the courts and yards. They wanted a drink, and it was beer, which played a major role in the development of King Street. Apart from 3 breweries, by 1875 the total number of pubs had risen to 83. At least that was the astonishing claim made 50 years later in 1925 by the Eastern Evening News. More realistically, however, popular estimates vary between 30 and 50 for the early years of the 20th century. Elsie reflects on the pubs, their gradual disappearance, and the demise of the Village on the Hill.
But I mean, the pubs used to be used. There wasn't more pubs, I suppose, in King Street than anywhere else. I don't know. They always seemed to be, to me, being a youngster. Everywhere you looked was a pub, more or less, or a shop. But the people were there. I mean, there used to be loads of little alleyways. I mean, up Thorn Lane, there was houses all the way up. There was Garden Street, there was houses all the way along. St Julian's Alley, Horns Lane. All those places had houses. Even down the little yards down to the river had houses. And one by one, they seemed to just disappear. They rehoused them and pulled the houses down, and they just seemed to disappear. And the street was never the same.
The reputation of the area for violence dated back to Victorian times. With such a preponderance of pubs, and no shortage of local tradesmen and artisans to use them, the potential for disorder was ever present. No better examples can be found than those involving Thomas Golder, a waterman who entered the Prince of Orange pub in 1850 and ordered drinks that he then refused to pay for. When challenged, Golder hit the landlord, Thomas Adcock, then continued to beat him whilst he was on the floor before also attacking his wife. On the 25th of February 1871, the Norwich Mercury reported that Golder had become drunk and righteous and had broken a square of glass in the window of the Old Barge. He had caused damage that cost 3 shillings to repair, and in a court hearing chaired by the Mayor of Norwich, he was fined 1 shilling and ordered to pay 5 shillings, 6 pennies in costs. So many years later, was it still a volatile environment for Elsie?
Burr Street, I suppose, there was a lot of hardness. I don't think that was any worse than it is today. I don't think they went out to murder anybody. I mean, today, if you have a punch-up, somebody usually ends up getting killed or something like that today. But they used to carry knives, and things like this today. But in those days, it was a pure punch-up.
Drunken Watermen apart, the village on the hill and neighbouring area was not short of other colourful characters, perhaps the most famous of whom was Black Anna, landlady of the Jolly Butcher's pub on Burr Street. Born Antoinette Hannant, of Italian descent, in 1905, she attained local fame performing in her pub as a jazz and blues singer, and was affectionately dubbed the English Sophie Tucker by visiting American servicemen during World War II. Elsie has particular cause to remember Black Anna, as she explains.
I remember Black Anna. I nursed her in hospital, actually. I was absolutely amazed when she came into hospital and I was on her ward. She died holding my hand. She was a dear old soul.
She's quite well known, though.
Oh, she was fantastic.
Why is that?
Well, because she used to be a blues singer, didn't she? She could belt a song out. She was a character. She used to dress all in black. She used to have black dangly earrings and black necklaces. And she used to dress all in black, long black clothes. She used to be a belter. She used to belt a song out in the blues, She used to be a fantastic blues singer.
She used to go around the pubs.
She used to do a lot of entertaining, yes, but mostly in her pub.
Her pub?
Yeah,
Oh,
she had one, yes, in what is it?
Dolly Butcher's.
Dolly Butcher's, yeah.
That
That was her pub. Yeah, she kept that, didn't she?
By the time Elsie was working as a nurse, she had married, left Norwich for Liverpool, returned and was devoting her energies to maintaining the name and memories of the pub she knew as a child. She campaigned vigorously to retain the Old Barge name and wrote to the Eastern Daily Press in the 1980s stating her case, but it was not to be. The pub had closed in 1969 and was sold to the City Council in 1979 by Whatney Mann, the brewers. Following renovation works, Robert Topp's original medieval trading hall was revealed in full splendour and the property officially renamed Dragon Hall. Then, following Norwich's designation as the UK's first UNESCO City of Literature, it became the National Centre for Writing in 2018. By that time, of course, the King Street and Village on the Hill areas had long since seen major changes following the City Council's radical slum clearance and redevelopment works of the mid-20th century. And all those pubs? Well, they disappeared too, leaving just the former Nag's Head as the sole King Street survivor. Now appropriately named the last pub standing, it remains as fitting testimony to this historic Norwich thoroughfare and its vibrant, if colourful past. Perhaps the sense of poignancy would not have been lost on William Blake.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast. The clips you've heard are from the Patricia Daniels collection. The catalogue to this particular archive is available online via the Norfolk Record Office's website. If you would like to listen to these or similar recordings, you can do so in the Norfolk Record Office's public search room. However, we'd be grateful if you could give us a couple of days advance notice of your visit. The Norfolk Record Office has attempted to contact contributors to the archive recordings or their next of kin. As you may expect after 40 years, this is not always possible. If you are related to any of the interviewees, the Norfolk Record Office would love to hear from you.